Okay, well, here we are. We're back again. We're ready for section 3 of E. Heidelman Julius, The Man and His Work by John W. Gunn. It is number 678. It's the first book I've read of the Little Blue Book series. Alrighty, here we go. Section 3. The love of good books and the desire to spread the reading of them, to lend one's fellows into the world of beauty, would be a praiseworthy motive to have inspired the Little Blue Books. There is, however, something beyond this limited literary motive. It is apparent in what has been said that Heidelman Julius has in mind the growth of knowledge as well as the growth of taste and beauty. He has made frequent use of the phrase a university in print, and it is true that the Little Blue Books are not simply books of individual merit, but that taken as a whole they have a broad educational value. The list has visible imperfections. It must be kept in mind that it is not a finished, but a developing work. Yet, as it stands today, this list offers especially to the person who has had few opportunities a real course of learning. All this is more or less obvious, though it is well that it should be stated plainly. There is a deeper idea of more varied and far-flung implications than that of merely conventional education, which Heidelman Julius regards as the soul and promise of the Little Blue Books. He values knowledge, not for its own sake, not as a sterile adornment, but for its effect upon man's day-by-day thinking, upon his individual and social being. Knowledge is the role of civilizer, the foe of all the stupid and evil forces that mar and threaten life, the head and front of progress. Heidelman Julius would consider it a petty and futile achievement if he did no more than fill empty minds. He would get no thrill out of the prospect of adding to the number of inanimate mental receptacles that Pope scornfully dismissed. The bookful blockhead ignorantly read, with loads of learned lumber in his head. Knowledge is a human factor, or it is worthless, says Heidelman Julius. If it does not vitally affect conduct, if it does not deepen the emotions, broaden the outlook, give one a more ordered and meaningful relationship to life, it is, I was about to say a bauble, but I shall say a dull and heavy encumbrance. People often mistrust the merely book-learned man, and all too frequently this translates itself into a mistaken prejudice against books themselves. But it is true that learning, which is merely counted by rote, a thing of blind and stubborn formula, is not life but death. And people instinctively shrink from death. One can see plenty of evidence that the educated man who lacks the vital spark that is the heart of culture is not very different under his mental disguise than his totally unlearned brother. He may be equally the victim of prejudice and self-interest and bitter, ingenuous emotions. Quite often one finds that he merely utters the common prejudice in more sophisticated language. Thus, an eminent professor and critic not long ago grouped several artists who are citizens of the United States by individual choice rather than the accident of birth, and lectured them gravely on the theme of Americanism. He didn't seek to analyze what these artists were trying to do, to study their art in a real critical spirit. All he did was to point out that they had foreign names or foreign accents, and that their art was not American. Whatever that may mean. Now, the book learning of this man is extensive, and he expresses himself in fluent and impressive language. But what he actually does is to give voice to the prejudice of the herd. And here is another professor, high in the academic world, speaking such nonsense as this: I look with equanimity upon evolution, or any other theory, nor do I care, relatively speaking, whether it is true or false, but I do care a great deal to drive men back to God's Word, the fountain of living waters, and that they shall hold it to be true, from Genesis 1 to Revelation, Revelation 22. Think of a man who is supposed to represent the nobility of learning, making the statement that he doesn't care whether a theory is true or false. This is a dreary example of the depths to which the academic mind can sink, and the narrow, lifeless atmosphere which produces minds given to such remarks is all too prevalent in our educational system. It is significant that in times of heat and crisis, when the herd feeling is rampant, one finds the doctors of dead learning, the soulless academicians, running madly with the herd, at the very front of it indeed. And the wildest and bitterest of all of their diatribes against the few men of vital and humane intelligence, the most important thing is that the human mind be free and curious and active, that knowledge be dynamic. The moment knowledge becomes static, it becomes a burden and a menace. It is hard to keep knowledge in a mummy. Let's reread that. It is hard to keep knowledge in a mummy case of scholastic tradition. It will rise from its dormant state and present a bold and living aspect, confounding the scholars and all men of small, timid minds. Time and again, knowledge has proven itself a vital factor in human affairs. It has dared to examine clearly and from new viewpoints the whole scheme of life, and to wrest the control of life these pages are old and little. To wrest the control of life that has ever been able to... I don't think that's the right page. Let's skip one. Okay, let's see. 41. Express himself in fluent. Yep, there's it. There we go. Control the life of. That is 43. Yep, there's 44. And we have a photograph here. E. Hadelman Julius at work in his office in the plant of the Hadelman Julius Company. Let's show that to you. Oops. Won't stay up. There you go. You can see that clearly. Okay. Now, continue on with the story. Okay, where we leave off. The whole scene of life, and to wrest the control of life from the tyranny of old, false, oppressive ideas. One of these occasions, one of the most brilliant and stupendous, was in the 18th century, and the half-century before the French Revolution, when Diderot and the encyclopedist, seizing the many-edged weapon of knowledge, put to flight the bigots and charlatans of an infinitely corrupt and hard and narrow orthodoxy. When on a recent visit to Gerard, I found Heidelman Julius in his library one evening reading John Morley's account of Diderot in the Encyclopedist. He was impressed by certain points of analogy and contrast, and by the similarity of the general idea that inspired Diderot. With his own thought and purpose in publishing the Little Blue Books, he talked at length of Diderot and his work. The tremendous figure of Diderot stands by the side of Voltaire in the 18th century. Someone has remarked that the 18th century was one of the peculiar fascination, as it gave full scope to the best as well as the worst, the strongest as well as the weakest impulses of human nature. Surely the best and the strongest found a worthy representative in Diderot. Diderot is an ideal example of the thinker in whom thought is alive, of the scholar who draws his chief impersonation from life and who relates his activities to the needs of men. Diderot's ample nature, his powerful and restless intellect, touched life at all points. He was richly endowed with thought, emotion, and an indomitable constructive will. He thought and felt deeply and boldly and generously. He had an infinite and dauntless curiosity about life, and he turned his thought and feeling into the most effective channels. Diderot bravely, but quietly and undramatically gave up a comfortable position in life in order to live laborious days and impoverished days as a scholar and seeker after wisdom in humble lodgings in Paris. As Diderot stood on the threshold of his life task, his monumental 20 years' labor on the Encyclopedia, nothing could have appeared more hopeless to the ordinary observer than that very task. The Church, although it had been shaken by schisms and frightened by a threatened decline of its power, seemed at that moment to be more strongly entrenched than for a number more strongly entrenched than for that okay, let's read that again. Threatened decline of its power seemed at that moment to be more strongly entrenched than for a number of years. It exercised a stern domination over the thoughts of men and stood apparently as a solid wall against all efforts towards the liberation and advancement of humanity. The Church, which for a long period had been the custodian of culture, the organizer and director of social life, had proven false to its trust, and was now not merely a force of obscuritarianism, but a tyrant that clamped on iron hand upon the whole of life. The authority of the Church had not gone unchallenged. Its doctrines had been disputed from time to time, but in a partial and ineffective way. This challenge to the Church had been not only the work of lone antagonists, but it had been purely intellectual, and it had lacked the unity and driving force of a broad viewpoint of life. It was not really so much of a challenge to the Church as an individual breaking away from the Church, and that not always a complete breaking away, but more often a denial of this or that point of theology. There has never been an age when there have not been a number of curious minds who were driven to speculate freely on the great questions of life and its origin, death and its nature, truth and its signs and portents. No rule of church or state, however wide and powerful, has ever been able to wholly subdue the impulse of philosophy. But the philosopher alone in his study is not a social force. and the church had, before the time of Deirdre, been able to suppress or remove isolated objectors. And certainly it had held its power unbroken and held firmly the social reins. A man of Deirdre's intelligence could not, of course, submit tamely to the dead hand of the church. He was bound to come into conflict with this obscurantism, that's the word, this oppression. Observe that no man, Deirdre or who else, could in that day engage in the honest pursuit of knowledge without finding in the church an inevitable enemy, and a pursuant, resourceful, malicious enemy. Deirdre was for a time a controversialist, and little more. In his attitude, an able controversialist, and good single-handed skeptic and doubter, but not a man of broad constructive purpose. He presented the liberal philosophy of English thinkers. To French readers, he translated Shaftesbury's Inquiry concerning merit and virtue under the title of Principles of Moral Philosophy, and under the impulses of Shaftesbury's Reflections, he came forward with a volume of his own philosophical thoughts. But it is not Deirdre's early controversies, his individual free thinking, that interest me. He did not stop there. He was on to the supreme and mighty work of his life, the Encyclopedia. He challenged the authority of the church in every field of social life, and not merely through direct polemics, but through the organization and dissemination of a knowledge of life that would make the position of the church untenable. He knew that the power of the church rested upon ignorance. It was his aim to destroy that ignorance by displacing it with knowledge. He had, too, a definite theory of life, a theory of active import that stood squarely opposed to the passive, obstructive theory of the church. The church had imposed upon men not only a view of life that was fixed and narrow, but one that was hopeless and denied the possibility of a free and gracious life. Human nature was inherently evil. This world was a vale of tears, and its many evils must be patiently borne with a pious gaze on the dim hereafter. Such was the attitude of the church. Still is. This dark and dismal view Deirdre assailed, and the Encyclopedia aided powerfully to dispel. Deirdre believed in the great possibilities of life, and he enforced this viewpoint of hope by showing the wonderful things life then actually held. The Encyclopedia covered all of life, not only the sciences and arts and trades, social and political and religious theory, but the practical details of social activity. I think the best picture of all, as showing Deirdre's infinite and patient work, is that of him going about to this and that workshop, observing how the artisans did their work, putting all sorts of questions, and even having a loom taken apart and rebuilt so that he could understand every detail of its mechanism. As Morley says, Deirdre wished to give an exact and complete a description of the arts and sciences that, if a deluge should sweep away all these things, and only a single copy of the Encyclopedia should be left, it would be possible to reconstruct the machinery of life from its pages. One of the features that distinguished the Encyclopedia was its collection of descriptive plates, which, to quote Morley, strikes the reader as a splendid panorama of all the busy life of the time. There is a charming description by Voltaire of a discussion among Louis Roman numerals, not a fan. I believe it is Louis the 15th. And a group of courtiers which reveals the practical nature of the encyclopedia. I should mention that the encyclopedia had friends at court who used their influence as often as possible in behalf of Deirdre and his co-workers, on the occasion of which Voltaire tells there was a dispute as to how gunpowder was made, and one of the courtiers remarked how strange it was that there was so much killing in hunting and in wars without anyone being aware of precisely how the killing was done. A lady of the court commented that she would like to know how her rouge was made. The Duc de la Valliere remarked that it was a pity the king had caused all of their encyclopedias to be confiscated, as in his work they could find the information they desired. The king defended himself. He had been told the work was dangerous, and he wanted to judge for himself before letting it circulate freely. But he sent three lackeys to bring in the encyclopedia, and when they returned, each carrying 7 of the large volumes, the facts about gunpowder and rouge were ascertained without difficulty. You can see how far removed was Deirdre from the pedantry. Pedantry? Pedantry. Pedantry. The passionless pursuit of passionless intelligence that I referred to a while ago. He was one of the most thoroughly human scholars who ever lived. There is a passage in one of Deirdre's articles that expresses this so forcibly, and that is so true and noble that I must read it to you. And I quote, "One consideration especially that we ought never to lose from sight is that, if we ever banish a man or the thinking and contemplative being from above the surface of the earth, this pathetic and sublime spectacle of nature becomes no more than a scene of melancholy and silence. The universe is dumb. The darkness and silence of the night take possession of it. It is the presence of man that gives its interest to the existence of other beings. And what better object can be set before ourselves in the history of these beings than to accept such a consideration? Why shall we not introduce man into our work in the same place which he holds in the universe? Why shall we not make him a common center? Is there in infinite space any other point from which we can, with greater advantage, draw these immense lots that we propose to extend to all other points? What a vivid and softening reaction must result between man and the beings by whom he is surrounded. Man is the single term from which we ought to set out, and to which we ought to trace all back. If we would please interest, touch, even in the most arid reflections, and the driest details, if you take away my own existence and the happiness of my fellows, of what concern to me is all the rest of nature?" The encyclopedia served its purpose, and now has only a historical interest. It had its defects. That sun is bright. I'll be right back. Okay. It had its defects. It must be remembered that this was the first great organization of human knowledge, though the encyclopedic idea in various forms has been put to use before, but none had essayed the gigantic task that Deirdre set before himself. Today, we have encyclopedias in plenty, and numerous repositories of technical knowledge. I would not leave the impression that the encyclopedia was totally devoid of propaganda. This could not well have been in view of the intense hostility between the Church and the new group of thinkers. A hostility that was necessarily personal in a great degree, as the Church could and did punish those who disputed its doctrines and its rule. Its influence in the state was powerful. It did not hesitate to have its enemies thrown into prison. Deirdre and his co-workers were constantly harassed by the authorities set upon them by the Church. On 2 occasions, work on the encyclopedia was suspended as a result of their persecution. This being the situation, it is small wonder that the encyclopedia had some spirited passages of propaganda. Nowadays, there are not the tremendous and cruel obstacles of the dissemination of knowledge that existed in Deirdre's time. There are forces today that are animated by the hate and fear of knowledge, and the flight insidiously against the spread of knowledge. But neither church nor state has the actual physical power over the lives and thoughts of men that these institutions closely allied possessed in the 18th century. It would be hard to estimate the influence of the encyclopedia. We do know, however, that it rested under one serious disadvantage. Its influence was confined to the nobility, to the wealthy class. It was not read by the common people. The 28 volumes of the encyclopedia, there were 11 volumes of plates, sold for a little more than $200. On the other hand, observe how great are the advantages of the little blue books in the popular spreading of culture. They are read by all classes. They are within easy reach of the poorest man. Moreover, there is a marked incentive to reading. New readers are made. Those who have read little now read much. From many angles, it can be seen that the striking ease with which the little blue books can be obtained acts as a stimulus that it creates as well as satisfies the desire for reading. They are not the kind of books that are left unread. To have them is to read them. They can be slipped into a pocket, read anywhere and under any circumstances, and are ideal companions for a journey. They are time savers, a fact that is important in this age of hurry. A man need not spend several days reading about the age of Shakespeare or of Addison. He can get the rich, significant material, the heart and essence of these periods in the couple of hours. This statement has in a couple of hours. Okay, period. This statement has an air of exaggeration, and it does require a qualifying word. Of course, I realize that a man could read many books about a period and still not thoroughly know the period. And if he could read everything that has been written about it, still he would not know it as he would had he actually lived in it. But I am speaking relatively with human limitations in mind. It is true that a period can be virtually illuminated if a writer knows how to choose his material and has the art of packing brevity to the full. Just as the drama, by showing us a man's life at a single critical point, can virtually illuminate the man's character and destiny. For example, how vividly does William Morris in A Dream of John Ball picture the English common life in the 14th century, and so does Finger in his sketch of England in Shakespeare's time, by describing a typical scene at the play. Throw a high light upon the life and manners of the period, If a man is eager for a knowledge of science, if he wishes to know the story of the evolution of the human race, it is not necessary for him to wade through many volumes written in difficult technical language. The story is very simple, yet fully and authentically told in the little blue books. And I think I'm going to stop there for this video. And we'll stop with page turn. We're going to page 53, but on page 52 there's a picture of the man, the myth, the legend, E. Heidelman Julius, however you pronounce it. Okay, so that's video number 3. It looks like we'll have 4 videos to complete this book.